Outwardly, they may still look unchanged, calm, detached, even emotionally unavailable at times, but what you are not seeing is that something they once tried to push down has become too heavy to keep buried. It is no longer something they can simply ignore or outgrow with time. This is not only about remembering you or missing you, it goes deeper than that. It is about what this connection awakened inside them and what it forced them to confront about themselves that they were not ready to face before. If you are noticing this inner shift, this subtle emotional movement, you are not imagining it. And if it resonates with you, you can simply acknowledge that you are present in this experience in your own way. What is happening is not random. They are standing at an inner crossroads, and no matter which direction they mentally explore, their thoughts keep circling back to you. For a long time, they believed that distance would eventually soften what they feel. They filled their space with distractions, responsibilities, conversations, work, ego protection, and emotional withdrawal. Anything that could quiet the intensity of what they were experiencing. There was a belief that if they stayed distant long enough, the feeling would fade on its own. But certain connections do not follow that pattern. Instead of disappearing, they deepen in silence. Instead of weakening, they settle into the subconscious. And what was avoided becomes something unresolved, something the mind keeps returning to in quiet moments. Now, what they tried to suppress is coming back with more clarity, not less. They are beginning to question the narrative they built around themselves just to stay emotionally comfortable. The explanations they once relied on are not feeling as solid anymore. And slowly, they are being forced into a more honest internal conversation with themselves. There is a division inside them now. One part feels a strong pull toward you, something emotional and instinctive, almost impossible to fully explain. It carries warmth, familiarity, and a sense of connection that feels rare and meaningful. But another part resists that pull completely, because accepting it would require emotional exposure, vulnerability, and the dismantling of inner defenses that were once built for protection. So they remain in this in-between state where nothing feels fully decided. They find themselves wondering why your presence continues to return in their thoughts without invitation, why your memory appears in the quietest moments when everything else goes still, and why no one else seems to replace the emotional imprint you left behind. This is the uncomfortable space before clarity, the stage where resistance starts to weaken but full acceptance has not yet formed. A place where internal certainty begins to crack, even if the outside still looks controlled. And in this space, emotional masks do not fall all at once, but slowly, piece by piece. If they return, it will not be random. It will come from a realization they can no longer avoid, that what they experienced with you was not ordinary, and not something that simply repeats in life. And if they choose a different path, it will not erase what was real between you. It will only reflect their readiness, or lack of readiness, to step into emotional honesty and transformation. And in all of this, your role is not to chase answers or force direction. It is not to bend yourself around uncertainty or try to control a process that is unfolding internally within someone else. Instead, the only stable position is allowing things to reveal themselves in time, without pressure, without distortion, and without losing your own center in the process. Because what is unfolding within them carries real emotional weight. It is not a passing thought or a temporary confusion. It is a deeper internal conflict that continues to build beneath their daily behavior. On one side, there is emotional attachment, memory, and a sense of belonging that feels meaningful and hard to replace. On the other side, there is fear shaped by past experiences, emotional wounds, disappointment, and the instinct to protect themselves from being hurt again. That protective voice becomes louder whenever emotions intensify. It pushes them to withdraw, to stay guarded, to avoid vulnerability. It convinces them that distance is safety. And so these two internal forces begin to collide more intensely over time. The pull toward connection and the pull toward self-protection. From the outside, this can look inconsistent. Moments of closeness, followed by sudden withdrawal. Times when they seem emotionally available, followed by silence. A pattern of approach and retreat that can feel confusing if seen only from the surface. But internally, it is often not about manipulation. It is about contradiction, wanting connection deeply while simultaneously fearing what that connection demands. As this internal pressure builds, old assumptions begin to break down. They can no longer easily dismiss what they feel or reduce it to something insignificant. The emotional imprint you left becomes harder to ignore. Memories return with more intensity. Feelings resurface with more weight than before. Even silence starts to feel meaningful rather than empty. If this is something you have been sensing, this sense that something unspoken is unfolding, it reflects this very process of inner change. Because every silence begins to carry meaning when the heart is no longer fully at ease with avoidance. Every absence begins to feel more noticeable when emotional attachment is still active beneath it. There eventually comes a point where emotional uncertainty becomes too heavy to maintain, not because everything outside has changed, but because the mind cannot remain divided forever. One side of them tries to minimize what this is, telling themselves it is not that serious or that it will fade with time. But another part no longer fully agrees with that story. And slowly, without any dramatic external event, internal clarity begins to form. Not all at once, but gradually, as resistance weakens and truth becomes harder to avoid. But something deeper within them is beginning to recognize that this is no longer the truth they can stand on. And that quiet inner recognition is what is bringing everything back to the surface with greater intensity. Feelings that run this deep do not simply vanish. They do not dissolve just because time passes or distance grows. Instead, they settle, they evolve, and they wait in silence until avoidance can no longer hold them back. Now, those emotions are returning in waves, in the stillness of late nights, in moments where nothing external is happening, in sudden memories that rise without warning during the day. They are starting to notice how frequently their thoughts drift toward you without any conscious effort, how your presence feels less like a memory and more like a quiet undercurrent in their daily awareness. How even the loudest distractions no longer fully erase the feeling that something meaningful is still unresolved. Your absence has played a deeper role in this than it may appear on the surface. By stepping back, you left space behind, space they could no longer fill with noise alone. And in that silence, they were left alone with themselves. That silence became a reflection they cannot easily turn away from, a mirror that keeps revealing what they have been avoiding: the emotional safety, the sense of connection, the warmth, and the rare familiarity your presence once brought into their life. When they finally began to feel the full weight of that absence, the question was no longer whether it mattered. It shifted into comparison, into reflection, into an uncomfortable awareness of what was real between you and what feels lacking everywhere else. Inside them now, fear and desire are no longer separated. They are colliding in the same space. One side of them is drawn toward you in a way that feels natural, emotional, and deeply instinctive. The other side is still trying to protect them, warning them not to lose control, not to reopen old emotional wounds, not to step into vulnerability again. But something has changed in the balance between these two forces. Desire is no longer quiet. It is starting to rise louder than fear, creating an internal tension they can no longer easily ignore. This is why they feel stuck. Not because the connection lacks meaning, but because it is forcing an internal confrontation they were not prepared for. What is unfolding now is no longer just about feelings between two people. It has become a turning point within their own identity. A decision about who they are when they are no longer running from what they feel. Outwardly, they may still appear distant, uncertain, or emotionally inconsistent, but that should not be mistaken for emotional absence. What is happening is internal overwhelm. They are realizing that staying in this in-between state, neither fully engaged nor fully detached, has slowly drained their sense of peace. It is no longer sustainable in the way it once felt. Now there is a quiet pressure building within them, not from the outside, but from within. A pressure to become honest with themselves, even if that honesty disrupts their comfort. Even if it requires letting go of old emotional patterns that once made them feel safe. The hesitation that once protected them is starting to feel different now, less like safety and more like confinement. The internal walls they built around their emotions are no longer solid in the way they used to be. They are beginning to weaken under the weight of what can no longer be denied. They are remembering the moments they stayed silent when they wanted to speak. The times pride took the place of honesty, the ways distance replaced clarity. And slowly, the gap between what they feel and what they express is shrinking on its own. Not because they are forcing change, but because avoidance is becoming harder to maintain. When a person is left alone long enough with their own thoughts, truth naturally begins to rise above everything else. That is what is unfolding now within them. Not because of external pressure, but because internal imbalance cannot last forever. Something within them is shifting, and it is growing stronger each day. They can no longer rely on uncertainty in the way they once did. There is a quiet unfolding taking place beneath their resistance. A gradual awakening that does not arrive all at once but builds slowly through reflection, memory, and emotional return. And if this resonates with what you have been sensing, it is because the connection itself has begun to occupy their quietest moments. It appears when everything else slows down. It returns when distractions lose their grip. It lingers when the noise of life fades into the background. Over time, this repeated return is reshaping how they understand the story between you. What once felt random now feels patterned. What once felt uncertain now carries emotional weight and meaning. And more importantly, they are beginning to realize something they did not fully see before. They were not only missing you as a person. They were missing the version of themselves that existed in your presence. The more open version, the more emotionally honest version. The version of them that felt less guarded, more present, and more alive in ways they may not have fully understood at the time. And the distance from that version of themselves has become increasingly difficult to ignore. This is where the shift becomes significant, because when someone begins to miss who they become with you, the question is no longer whether the connection mattered. The question becomes whether they are willing to face what that connection revealed about them. As this awareness deepens, external distractions begin to lose some of their power. Life continues as usual on the surface, filled with routines, tasks, people, and movement. But underneath it all, there remains a consistent pullback to the same place. Back to what was felt. Back to what remains unresolved. This is the stage where internal defenses begin to loosen. The part of them that once prioritized control and emotional distance starts to lose its dominance. Not because fear has disappeared, but because the emotional cost of avoidance has begun to outweigh the comfort it once provided. Now they are standing between two internal directions. One is familiar, controlled, and emotionally limited. The other is uncertain, vulnerable, but far more real. And for the first time, truth is beginning to feel more important than protection. That is where courage quietly begins. Not in the absence of fear, but in the moment truth starts to matter more than fear itself. And with that shift, something inside them settles, not fully resolved, but no longer completely resisting, more still, more aware, and more honest than before. They are beginning to allow these emotions to speak more honestly within them now. What was once pushed down, delayed, or rationalized is slowly being acknowledged as real. And with that acceptance comes a quieter kind of peace, not because everything is resolved, but because the internal tension is no longer as chaotic as it used to be. The conflict is gradually shifting into something more structured, more aware, and more directional. It feels as if they are standing at the edge of an older version of themselves, looking towards something unfamiliar but increasingly undeniable. Between where they have been and where they are being pulled, there is only one real bridge left, a decision that requires honesty without avoidance. This becomes a moment of reflection, almost like looking into a clearer mirror. The silence that once helped them avoid discomfort is now reflecting their own emotional truth back at them. It reveals where pride interrupted connection, where fear replaced honesty, and where avoidance quietly created distance that did not need to exist. They are not just remembering the past anymore. They are reprocessing it with a different level of emotional maturity. Conversations, pauses, gestures, and unfinished moments are returning to their awareness, but this time with deeper understanding. They can now recognize where fear was guiding their choices and where something real was trying to form beneath the surface. And this is no longer just about regret or nostalgia. It is about re-evaluating priorities. What once felt important, control, image, emotional protection, staying safe within familiar patterns, is slowly losing its emotional weight. Compared to the depth of genuine connection, those things begin to feel less meaningful than they once did. At the same time, another shift is happening internally. Empathy is expanding. They are beginning to sense what their distance may have felt like from your side. They are starting to understand the emotional space left behind by uncertainty, silence, and inconsistency, and that understanding naturally softens something within them. It becomes harder to stay emotionally detached once accountability starts to take shape internally. They are no longer reacting only from fear. A more conscious awareness is beginning to form in how they see themselves and their choices. And when someone reaches that level of self-reflection, things stop feeling casual or dismissible. Even if nothing is expressed outwardly yet, internally it becomes serious in a quiet, grounded way. Because now they are beginning to realize that whatever comes next will say something important about who they are becoming. The final layers of hesitation are starting to weaken. The old mental patterns of maybe and someday are losing strength. In their place, a different kind of inner pressure is forming, one that feels more like responsibility than emotion. Time itself feels different to them now, less infinite, more limited, more meaningful. And with that shift comes a growing awareness that staying emotionally stuck is not neutral. It is also a choice, and one that carries its own weight. This realization is not only mental, it is felt physically as well, like pressure in quiet moments, like tension when thoughts return to you, like a pause before action that lingers longer than it used to. The unknown still carries fear, but the emptiness of emotional disconnection is beginning to feel heavier than the fear of vulnerability itself. What this passage is describing is a gradual internal psychological shift inside a person who has been emotionally conflicted for a long time. It is not about sudden change or dramatic realization, but about a slow process where suppressed emotions, thoughts, and unresolved feelings begin to rise again because the mind can no longer keep them fully buried. At the beginning, the idea of movement beginning to form refers to subtle emotional activity. This is not external action yet, it is internal awareness becoming more active. Thoughts that were previously pushed away or avoided start to return on their own. This happens when emotional suppression loses its strength. The mind can only hold back feelings for a limited time before they naturally reappear in quieter, more honest moments. When it says silence is becoming harder to maintain, it is describing emotional pressure building internally. Silence here does not just mean not speaking to someone, it means emotional suppression, holding back feelings, avoiding expression, and staying in a controlled or distant state eventually becomes mentally and emotionally exhausting. At some point, maintaining that distance takes more energy than acknowledging what is actually felt inside. The passage then emphasizes that if anything happens next, it will not be impulsive. This is an important distinction. It is saying that any future action would not come from random emotion, confusion, or temporary longing. Instead, it would come from deeper reflection and self-confrontation. This means the person is slowly facing themselves honestly, looking at what they feel, why they avoided it, and what it means for their life and identity. This kind of inner process is usually slow, layered, and emotionally heavy. When it mentions internal restructuring, it is describing a deeper psychological reorganization. The person is not just changing their mind, they are beginning to change how they understand themselves, relationships, and emotional safety. Old coping mechanisms like avoidance, emotional distancing, or overthinking are starting to weaken. This is why the stage feels significant. It represents a transition from emotional avoidance toward emotional awareness. The next key idea is the imprint left by the other person. This is not meant in a mystical way, but in a psychological sense. It means the connection had a strong emotional impact that influenced their inner world. The person they are thinking about became associated with certain feelings, connection, vulnerability, emotional intensity, or self-awareness. Because of this, even when the person is not physically present, the emotional memory remains active in the subconscious mind. When the passage says something they cannot unsee, it refers to self-awareness that has been triggered. Through this relationship or connection, the person may have seen parts of themselves more clearly, how they behave in intimacy, how they avoid vulnerability, or what they truly desire emotionally. Once a person sees themselves in a new way, it is difficult to return completely to the previous mindset. As the text continues, it describes clarity increasing and confusion fading. This is the natural outcome of prolonged reflection. When someone spends enough time mentally revisiting emotions and experiences, contradictions begin to settle. The mind stops spinning in as many directions, and a more stable understanding starts forming. It does not mean full resolution has happened, but it means the emotional noise is reducing. The line about resisting feelings, making them stronger, reflects a known psychological pattern. When emotions are consistently suppressed, they often return more intensely over time. Avoidance does not eliminate feelings, it delays processing them. So instead of disappearing, the emotions become more persistent in thoughts, memories, and internal reflection. The passage also highlights a shift from emotional chaos to choice. This is a key turning point. Earlier, the person may have felt confused, reactive, or unsure. But now, the emotional situation is becoming more structured internally. Instead of just feeling overwhelmed, they are beginning to recognize that they have options, continue emotional avoidance and protection, or move toward honesty, vulnerability, and potential connection. Choice here represents maturity and responsibility. It means the person is no longer only reacting emotionally, but starting to consciously evaluate what they want to do with those emotions. This is where internal growth becomes visible, when feelings are no longer just experienced, but reflected upon. Finally, the passage suggests that whatever happens next will not be random. It will be the result of everything they have been internally processing. This means future actions, whether reconnecting, expressing feelings, or maintaining distance, will likely come from accumulated self-awareness rather than sudden impulse. It frames the situation as a culmination of a long internal journey rather than an isolated moment. In simpler terms, the whole passage is about someone slowly moving from emotional avoidance to emotional awareness. It describes the transition from suppression to reflection, from confusion to clarity, and from hesitation to conscious chaos. In conclusion, this entire process is not just about emotions or distance between two people. It is about an inner transformation that unfolds quietly over time. What begins as avoidance, confusion, or emotional silence gradually turns into reflection, awareness, and self-confrontation. The feelings that were once pushed aside do not disappear. They return in moments of stillness, asking to be understood rather than ignored. As this inner process deepens, clarity slowly replaces confusion. The person is no longer only reacting from fear or protection, but beginning to see the truth of what they feel and what this connection has revealed within them. Old defenses like pride, emotional distance, and control start to lose their strength, while honesty and self-awareness begin to take their place. At this stage, everything comes down to choice. Not confusion, not impulse, but conscious recognition. The choice between staying in familiar emotional safety or stepping into vulnerability and truth. This is what makes the moment significant. It is no longer about what was avoided, but about what can no longer be denied. What remains is awareness. Awareness that the connection left an imprint, awareness that suppression only delayed understanding, and awareness that silence was never emptiness. It was a space where realization slowly formed. And from that awareness, whatever happens next will not be random. It will be the result of an inner shift that has been building all along, quietly but powerfully, until clarity finally takes its place.